So what is your favorite piece of naval history heritage?
A lot of people around the college know that my little Gmail icon is the "Don't Give Up the Ship" flag. So as an Ohioan, there's not a lot of naval battles in Ohio, but the Battle of Lake Erie is a very significant historical one. So as I was growing up in northern Ohio, getting to go out fishing and seeing Perry Monument out there on the lake, sort of brought the attention to, hey, there's history that's happened here, and sort of got me interested in the Navy and things like that. So for me, that's sort of a touchstone because it's where I grew up and sort of grew up around it.
Don't give up the ship.
Yep.
Hey, I'm Chief Xander Gamble, and on this week's episode of Pass the Word, we have our Associate Dean of Naval Studies, Mr. Russ Evans here, and we're going to be talking about the second course in the Naval Studies program, NAV 102, Modern Naval History. So, like we did with the last one, let's talk about the reason why. Why did we choose the Modern Naval History as a course in this certificate program?
Sure. After we move from 101, where we sort of look at ourselves and the ethics and that aspect of it, we wanted to provide a foundation for the rest of the courses. And if you understand how things are connected, where you start, and how things build on each other, it really helps with the rest of the courses to have that context. So when we say modern naval history, we start about 1890, so just before the Spanish-American War, where the United States sort of looks at itself and says, I think navies are important. I'm going to be looking more outward, and so that's really where the discussion about what the United States should do as a naval power, what should our relationship be with others. So that's why we start where we start, and then history not only for the context, but the interesting thing for me really is the case study aspect of it. So if you were going to go to business school and you're going to Harvard Business School, they would say, all right, look at these case studies, things that actually happened in business, and see what you can take from them. So we don't necessarily study history just to be historians because we want to memorize dates and facts and things like that. But what we want to do is understand, here's an example of a challenge. Here's what leaders had to think about. Here's what the country thought about as far as what it needed to do with the Navy and how it thought about its place in the world, and learn from that. It's not that you're going to see the same problem necessarily as those individuals saw, but you may see similar problems. The thing that is interesting, I think, that you really take the most from is, how did individuals who faced a similar problem to you find the solution? It's not necessarily the solution they came up with, but the process they used to come up with the solution that's important. A lot of times when you look as far as what is this like? Okay, I think this part of history is like this other part of history, but you also have to understand the differences. So it's like, okay, I can't just do exactly what they did in that part of history, because the thought that two times in the world are going to be exactly the same, that's pretty small. But if you understand the differences between that time in history and this time in history, you'll be able to refine the examples that you're taking from the historical side and say, here's what I understand I can keep, and here's what I understand is different. And so from that perspective, trying to look at where's a good place to start, how do we what can we pull from that, from either leadership or international affairs or other things. History cuts across all of those things. So before we went on with any other course, after looking at ourselves, we thought, hey, we have to have a foundation in the past for us to talk about future things, and then the case study aspect of it to say, hey, here's how other people solved challenges and made decisions and evaluated what was important. And history is a great teacher for things like that.
So in the case study aspect of studying that, taking those examples, are there any specific case studies that you cover?
Well, we'll go all the way from, like we said, the United States and understanding how it's going to relate to the world with the Marines in the Caribbean and in the Philippines, the Navy where we become a power that's looking much more outward after the Spanish-American War, because we have the Philippines and Puerto Rico, and so now we're more concerned about not just our own hemisphere, but what's going on in the world. And so from that perspective, a lot of how the United States decides it's going to interact with the rest of the world, because it's not just concerned about expanding in the West, because that's taken care of. Rebuilding from the Civil War is complete. So the United States, the first philosophy it has as far as what it's going to do comes from those time periods. And then you can see how that evolves through World War I and World War II, where the United States becomes more interested in other places because those other places can impact it. So the United States thought, hey, we're going to stay in our own little part of the world here, and then it expands more and more where it interacts with the world and the lessons that are learned. A lot of what we'll see in further courses sort of starts in the post-World War II era. So you have the opportunity to see how the United States and the role of the Navy expands from that time through the First World War, through World War II, and into the post-war era. So for that, it's not necessarily one thing. It's the ability to connect many dots and understand what were people thinking when they made this decision, so you understand what happens afterwards. So it's the context that comes into play. And again, the Marines obviously have certain touch points in their history, as does the Coast Guard and the Navy. And to bring all of those things together, it's like, well, I've never thought of this battle from this perspective because I was always looking at it from my service, and now I see how these things fit together. Or it's like, I didn't know the Coast Guard was at Guadalcanal, and things like that. So each service bringing their own history and their own perspective into those conversations, I think it helps everybody see how things fit together. So when we have conversations later, they have that foundation and understand where each other's coming from.
So how have the students responded to that case study approach?
I think they've enjoyed it because they've had an opportunity, again, not only to have something that they're familiar with in their own service history, but to see how other components fit together. So if I'm looking at, we'll take the Guadalcanal example. So here you have like the only Medal of Honor winner for the Coast Guard is covering an amphibious withdrawal for the Marines on Guadalcanal. And so the understanding of the small boat aspect of the Coast Guard and how important that is for expeditionary operations might not be something that people think about. And then the aspect of how why was the Navy doing what it was doing? Why did it? The Battle of Salvo Island, where the Japanese come in and take out a large portion of the Navy. Some people don't realize that more sailors were killed at Guadalcanal than there were Marines. So a lot of Marines, hey, what was the Navy doing? And the Navy was actually fighting a more costly battle than the Marine Corps was at the time. But it's also a great story about how things come together. So you have carrier aircraft that are being flown to Henderson Field to defend the island, and you have all the services working together in an expeditionary fashion. It's sort of almost like an advanced base, and how they're working across warfare areas. There's a ground fight, there's a sea fight, there's an air fight, and all the services are contributing to it. And that's to me one of my favorite case studies, because you can see where people who are writing doctrine and strategy now, what they're looking back towards and what they're pulling from when they're saying, hey, well, how might a fight in the Pacific look like if all the services had to come together and have an advanced base? How do we work together and leverage the expertise across all of the services?
So it's kind of like taking a step back and like looking at it from a bigger perspective.
Yes, and even to the point where we look at, say, later in the 60s and the 70s, where what was the Soviet Navy gets as big, or in some cases even bigger than the United States Navy, because the United States was spending so many resources in Vietnam, and understanding the questions and choices that had to be made with, okay, what are we going to spend money on? How are we going to do research? How are we going to approach a new naval threat that we didn't have to worry about before, because we were spending a lot of time, efforts, and resources in a very long counterinsurgency. So some people might see the parallels there between what was happening with the Soviets and the U.S. in Vietnam, with the United States in Afghanistan, and what's going on with China. So it provides some perspective and context when you see, oh, this stuff like this has happened before. Here's how people dealt with it. What are some lessons learned on problem solving that we could apply?
Nice. So they get done with this course. They've learned all the interactive history from multiple perspectives. How do they take this and apply it into their job?
We say that we provide better context for service. So the one thing that we all know, or I should say, is seems to be a consistent trend, is that more and more responsibility is being pushed further down the chain of command, because things are becoming more dispersed. So as each individual ship becomes more capable, then we've seen fewer ships, and as weapons become more accurate, we've seen ships work further and further apart. For the Marines, the same thing. As far as the more things you put close and tight together, the more likely you are to lose them. So you're spreading things out. So if the Navy and the Marine Corps and the Coast Guard, which is more used to working in smaller units, has to have more responsibility put on the unit with less support, that means everybody has to think more echelons up. And from that perspective, to go back and look at that context and understand how things fit together, that's really a theme that goes throughout all the courses. So if we're going to put more responsibility and more power because of technology in the hands of more junior people, we need to make sure that they're prepared to understand that. If you see opportunity, or you see risk sooner, then that unit is going to be more lethal, because speed is important. So if you understand context because you see something, hey, this reminds me of this historical case, and I think this thing is important, or this is an opportunity, or this is a risk, and that gets identified lower down the chain of command, then we become a faster, more lethal organization. So a lot of what we do is based on that philosophy, and that is something that's important. And so starting with the case studies and the history, I think, is a good introduction to that.
So it gives the sailor, the Marine, the Coast Guardsman the ability to think on a larger scale at a more junior level.
Exactly.
Awesome. So essentially the NAV 102 course, the Modern Naval History, to sum it up, it was selected because we wanted a case study approach to understanding history through the naval services, so that we could take those problems and apply them to current thinking and find out problem-solving skills, rather than just studying history for the facts and figures, right? And so you're going to study case studies from the 1890s up through World War II, essentially, right?
All the way to 2010.
Oh, all the way to 2010, so all the way into the modern era. And really the best thing is that sailors, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen can take from this is those problem-solving skills, thinking at that larger level, at that more junior level, and having the understanding to do more with less.
Yes, we'd like to call it applied history.
Applied history sounds great. So sign up for USNCC today, usncc.edu, and you'll get to take this course in naval history and become a better case study historian, if you will.
That sounds like a plan.